Hello everyone, my name is Garrett Vink. I cover tech and AI and defense tech for the Washington Post out in Silicon Valley. I just thank you all for being here. Thank you guys for being here. We have Mac Thornberry, obviously a very distinguished career in Congress, huge, long-term history looking at cyber, and now general man about tech innovation town, I guess. Josh L'Espinazo, CEO of Shift5 and a former Army officer working on cyber issues in his previous career, and of course Rep. Don Bacon, former Air Force general, and maybe talking, I feel like you've been in the news a little bit, but I don't necessarily want to put you on the spot, but hopefully we'll get into that. So,
hey, the main thing to know about me is Mac Thornberry was my chairman.
Yeah.
He was darn good.
And of course, the representative is on the subcommittee for cyber on the House Armed Services. So he probably knows a lot of things that he may not even be able to talk to us about today. Talking about cyber and innovation, I was thinking about the previous panels, and coming from Silicon Valley, I talked to obviously a lot of startups who are sort of part of this wave of energy that is saying, we want to contribute to U.S. defense. We want to work with the Pentagon. How do we get in there? What are the challenges and that kind of thing? And cyber is an interesting one because I think there's just even more so than some of these other smaller tech companies that are getting in on the hardware side. There's been even longer tradition of cyber companies, cybersecurity companies being involved in national security, and so there's maybe a little bit more of a history there, sort of a pedigree that is kind of interesting. And so there's a couple things that we want to kind of jump in on that with. But I was just kind of reading about Salt Typhoon, which is a sort of major hack that we had last year from a Chinese commercial company that was sort of contracted by the Chinese government. So when we talk about private versus public, it's not just us that are having that conversation and turning to the private sector. And in a story that some of my colleagues at the Post wrote, they were quoting retired General Paul Nakasone, a giant in the cyber and intel community who's actually now on the board of OpenAI, so also kind of playing there. And he was saying, the U.S. is neither keeping up with nor deterring the Chinese. We're facing an adversary whose size, sophistication, and speed are outpacing us. And he went on to say that the Trump administration needs a more comprehensive strategy to partner with private sector and our allies to just move forward and break through some of these barriers and get moving on that mission. And so, I don't know, Mac, if you wanted to kind of just maybe give us a bit of a level set about where we are right now when it comes to cyber espionage, cyber warfare. What is sort of the context that this room needs to know going into this conversation?
If you step back, I think it's important to remember that cyber is a domain of warfare in which there is conflict every day, and in which the stakes are getting higher every day. The Nakasone comment caught my attention too, because as you point out, he says we're increasingly falling behind. And he also said that it's bleeding from the digital into the physical. And most of us tend to still think of cyber as, well, my computer's not working, we've got scammers and so forth. But we are in a place, or rapidly approaching a place, where we may have whole missiles, drones, satellites not work because of cyber. There have been stories that talk about digital bombs, if you will, placed in infrastructure, so we lose electricity. We have this, that, or the other thing happen with civilian infrastructure because of cyber. So it's not something that you can just put over there on a shelf and say, oh, those smart geeks are going to take care of it. It is interconnected to everything. And so for our purposes, I think we need to think about innovation within the domain of cyber, where Nakasone says we're falling behind, but also the connectedness of cyber to all the other innovation that goes on. And that's where you get into stealing intellectual property and a whole variety of things where cyber, or you could just use the word digital, is connected to every part of what we do in our daily lives, much less defend the country. It's all an essential part.
And Representative, I mean, you sort of are on the front lines, kind of seeing what is coming and going, and obviously the big story last year was Salt Typhoon, Chinese hack of major U.S. telecom companies, access to President Trump and his staff potentially. Kamala Harris as well, I think, was targeted in that. I mean, what is the U.S. dealing with right now? What are the biggest threats that you're kind of seeing at the Intel Committee, Arms Service? Yeah.
Our experts say China has exceeded Russia in being the threat in the cyber world. And I'd say a year ago we would have said the Russians were the most aggressive, and now it's the Chinese, and that's what I hear from our experts. I think one of the biggest problems we have, we're doing almost a year-long CR. Our military cannot flourish when you do, and first of all, we did like a 1% growth in the previous year, which was 2% under inflation. So that's a reduction for the military. That's got to affect cyber. It's got to affect NSA and Cyber Command. It affects all of our services. Now we're doing a CR 6 months in. We're talking about doing a permanent one. So I know Sunday I put out an X, I still call it a tweet, saying a year-long CR is bad for military. You cannot honestly say we're trying to match the Chinese and deter China and Russia and Iran with a year-long CR. I did that before I went to church. While I was at church, the White House called me. They said, "Hey, we read your tweet." And she goes, they said, we know we got to do anomalies within the CR. We can't let the, but I guess my whole point is, from the very top, we're holding back cyber and all of our military with this dysfunctional budgeting process that it's acceptable. It's within norms to just do it till December. It starts getting bad if it's after December. Well, okay, we're in March, and now we're talking about doing one all the way through, and it's broken. So Congress has to fix this if we want to have a defense that can match that. So, but to your question, maybe I'll be a little more granular on some stuff. General Hawk, he was a colonel when I was a 1-star. I love him. He's a good man. Honest, I trust him. But what's going on is China is into our energy grid. They're into our phones. They're into everything. We're really good on the cyber intelligence, but we have ROEs that do not let us do nearly what China or Russia does. So how do you deter China and Russia? I don't think it's by taking punches to the face and say, "Can I have another?" Right? I think we got to be able to allow Cyber Command to fight fire with fire. I wouldn't even advertise it that much. Just carry the big stick and get them back. And so I think our policies are even holding us back. And then maybe the third thing, we want to cure everything in DoD ourselves. And as Chairman Thornberry said, and you were alluding to your question, our private industry is way ahead of us on software. So we got to get the synergy in all forms of our DoD with the private sector on software to include Cyber Command, and because it provides synergy. And we can't invent all the software ourselves. We're not as good at it. So there's just a couple of additions to what Chairman Thornberry said.
Josh, I mean, you've kind of been on both sides of it. You've been within the military fighting these cyber wars, and now on the private sector. I'm curious, I mean, in your time here now in the private sector, I mean, what is sort of the appetite or the interest amongst private cybersecurity companies to essentially build cyber weapons or to join this conflict?
Yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of interest, among the private sector in applying all of the skills that they have on military problems and for the DoD. I think the challenge is not one of motivation or will or wanting to contribute. It's the perception and in some cases reality that it's a very difficult place to do business, and especially if you're a venture-backed startup and you have kind of limited capital and runway, you're a calorie-preserving animal, right? And so you're going to kind of spend your time on the incremental sort of projects and things that that are going to help grow your business. I see a lot of profound progress in the past 10 years, but there's still quite a ways to go. I think, to kind of echo what Chairman Thornberry said about the transition from purely digital domain into some of these spaces of operational technology. I spent much of my military career looking at the cybersecurity vulnerabilities of military weapon systems. It's not something that we think a lot about, just because you look at a Abrams tank and you think it's a 70-ton American freedom machine. There's not much technology on it, but the reality is the relationship between computers and weapon systems is almost deeper than the relationship between consumer technology and digital. The F-14 Tomcat, there's actually got declassified a couple of years ago. The first microcontroller ever invented on planet Earth was for the F-14 Tomcat, because it's sort of complicated to fly, and the systems have gotten more and more complicated over the past several decades, to the point where an F-35 is generating terabytes of data during a flight. And if we can't figure out a way to reduce the opacity of these systems, make them more accessible for a broader community to be able to do things like build cyber protections into them, and then also illuminate a path for those folks to be able to do meaningful business with the DoD and sustain their companies. It's going to be a hard road ahead, and we're going to continue to fall behind the adversaries.
Yeah, I mean, I remember about a year ago I was at the DIU, and I was in a very interesting sort of side kind of discussion room, and it was essentially drone maker startups kind of, they were getting pretty upset about some of the restrictions they have and the sort of standards that they need to meet when it came to cybersecurity, and they obviously understood why we need those standards, but there was just a lot of frustration. It was kind of like one of the few moments in my career where I've sort of seen like a real break between the view from the private sector and the view from the Defense Department people in the room, and it was, I think people were sort of furiously taking notes and afterwards sharing cards, and they're like, let's try to fix this problem. But there's still, I feel, like a pretty significant gap in terms of, okay, we get that Washington wants the innovation sector and private companies to kind of build for these things. They're willing to change some policies, but obviously the bar still remains very, very high when it comes to cybersecurity. And I also think about this a lot when we hear conversations like on the previous panel about trying to increase manufacturing here in the U.S. and maybe bringing supply chains in-house. There's a reason why it costs so much to build an F-35, and a big part of that is security, to make sure that nowhere along the line can anyone get into that system. And so I still feel like I haven't seen a good answer about how you increase manufacturing times, make manufacturing cheaper, use more commercial off-the-shelf parts, but at the same time keep our weapons secure so that they work when we need them to work. And so I'll just kind of, that's a big question, but I don't know if any of you want to jump in on that or how you think about it.
I would just say, of course, there is a tension between broadening out your innovation base, bringing in more non-traditional companies, including small companies, and having standards on the other side that say you have to meet these cyber requirements. The whole new CMMC standards, for example, are less than they were, but still costs some money. And so we're going to have to balance that out somewhat. But if you step back and look at what's happening in Ukraine, they've got to change their software every couple of weeks or so. So it's not like you can fix it and then it's fixed.
Yep.
You've got to keep working at it. And so that's going to be a cost we have to build into our systems, I think.
I think that's exactly right, and to echo something that Christian said at a previous panel, when you open up these kinds of problems to private companies, they're going to innovate and they're going to create ergonomics around this. And there are a couple of defense tech companies growing up now that have massively accelerated the ATO process, the authority to operate, in getting software shipped to the end user. So I'm encouraged by a lot of the innovation there. I think one of the parts of the conversation, particularly surrounding the battlefield, the weapon systems themselves, that we may be kind of missing is, the DoD has spent trillions of dollars fielding hundreds of amazing weapon systems that have been in service for decades and will continue to be in service for decades. We're focusing a lot on talking about building autonomy and AI into these new builds of platforms. What I see, though, is yes, and we need a software surge on the old stuff. You know, the Arleigh Burke class destroyers that are going to be in service, the B-52 is going to be in service for another 30 years, with a very small amount of marginal investment in creating a digital makeover for those kinds of platforms. You open up a tremendous amount of how the military does its business to that broader community. If you do it the right way, you know, you can create the sort of ergonomics and safety around how software and autonomy gets deployed to the edge on an Osprey or, you know, an F-22 while we're also building the new platforms.
I was just thinking of the F-35, and I've used this example before because I'm a little more familiar with it. It's the best fighter plane in the world. Israelis come back, I talked to the fighter pilots that are Israelis, said it's exceeding their expectations and how they were using it. But the problem is with Block 4, it's the software, and so it's like the intelligence mission data. And you got to take maybe 200 pictures of a T-72 tank, so the system can identify it's a T-72, maybe hundreds of M1s, okay, it's an M1, T-80s, T-90s. Well, they're trying to do that internally, and yet I know companies out there that have this, that we could import that in, and so we need to do better, maybe subcontracting to these companies on the software. No, we can match the hardware on this airplane, but
Yeah.
I just see there's some opportunities to bring in more of the software geniuses that are out there and I think that's what the F-35 probably needs.
What's like how do you do that? I mean, what's the platform? Because I mean that's a particular problem. I think like 2 people in 3 hours could solve that in Silicon Valley, right? So like
But
how
we
do you
do better
make
in our
that
acquisition and how we write the rules. I think we've learned from the F-35 that you can't have sole ownership of the software and things like that.
Right.
I would say there's a culture in the Pentagon too. It's like if you left them to their own devices, they would say we're going to design all our software on our own, and we'll put it out in 5 years, after 5 times the cost that the private sector can do it. Why? Because that's all we know how to do. So it does. I think Congress once in a while can provide a value added by forcing them to do things that they wouldn't do on their own.
I got to say, you know, in working with a lot of these program offices, you know, they're incredibly talented individuals that have a very, very difficult job. And in situations like, I don't say that the V-22, which has had, you know, tremendous difficulties for decades, but especially recently with operational pauses, and 65 service members have died on that platform because of, you know, non-combat related accidents. You know, the program office is embracing any and all comers to try to help fix the problem. And to give you kind of put a finer point on this idea of a software surge on these platforms, you know, there's a system that's installed on the Osprey. They designed this in the late 80s, early 90s. And they knew it was a complicated platform to fly, and the aerodynamics are kind of, it's called the V-sled. It's got a bunch of vibration sensors and optical sensors and all this stuff. But it was designed when the 5.5-inch floppy disk was like the, you know, most modern form of storage. And because these, you know, these systems, for a good reason, you know, are go through an onerous process of making sure it's reliable, it's safe, it works in all these different kinds of conditions, it hasn't had, you know, technologists try to evolve that system for 3 decades. And, you know, folks are looking at that platform and saying, hey, you know, we can kind of add a little bit of modern technology to this and put an iPad in the cockpit and alert pilots to these super dangerous situations that are happening with the gearboxes and hard clutch engagements. And it's not fancy ML or AI, it's like taking data that's already there and putting it in front of eyeballs that are going to save lives. And there's so many examples of that kind of through line in these platforms that were designed in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And for very little marginal investment, you can create the infrastructure that allows really smart folks to solve incredibly important problems on a platform you've already spent billions of dollars on.
Well, this is how Raj Shah got involved.
That's
Doing
right.
exactly what you're saying.
That's right. Yep.
He says, I could just get a handheld here and solve all my problems.
He's a smart guy.
That's the DIU.
So maybe, you know, existing programs that have been running for a while, but the software is also controlled by those companies that built those platforms, and maybe, you know, elbowing them a bit to crack that open and let other people try to solve these problems. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's some efforts in the DoD that are really encouraging the, you know, modular open systems architecture, and the fighter. I hate to say, as a former Army guy, the Air Force probably is out in front of, you know, on this modernization piece. But you know, the government reference architecture, where they're creating enclaves on the fighter jet, that is government controlled, so that they have the ability to, get fed data from the aircraft and ship software to the edge and iterate on that very quickly. There's a lot of smart folks that are creating the demand signal on this. I think, bring it back to cybersecurity though, the one thing I will say I am concerned about is when it comes to things that touch mission capability and safety and uptime and mission, there's a lot of energy behind that, because that's how program offices think. They think in those terms. How do I do more with less? What are my priorities? I think, not to come off as Chicken Little here, but I think that the thing that I am most gravely concerned about is the cyber vulnerabilities that are latent in these systems that have accrued so much digital technology. And there was a GAO report that came out in 2018, Weapons System Cybersecurity, calling out all this technology and all the different access vectors of radio frequency and the dozens of different protocols that an aircraft talks, or supply chain, or maintenance support devices that you're plugging into these things are access vectors. And compared to an enterprise network where you've got a million different cybersecurity solutions, your multi-factor authentication, your firewalls, your endpoint detection, all that kind of stuff, there's nothing on these systems. And so, I think we can do this all with the same kind of infrastructure, just investing in digitally modernizing these systems, gaining the observability, making it really hard for an adversary to penetrate, but also making it easy for the tech community to penetrate.
And to directly to your point, Ken Calvert, he's the chairman of the Appropriations Committee for Defense. Talk about significant plus up for DIU and these kind of efforts to sort of force the Pentagon into doing acquisition now that's off the shelf, that's better than what we have. So that's one way that we can help inject ourselves into this.
But don't underestimate how hard this sort of change is. We put into law in 2016 a requirement that new systems have to have modular open system architecture.
Yeah.
But it's not happening. So the kinds of things that they're talking about, fixing the vulnerabilities that we know, improving the software on legacy systems, requires an agility and a pace that is countercultural for the Pentagon.
I'm wondering, with the new administration, I would say, after President Trump was elected, there was a lot of excitement, again, in Silicon Valley that, okay, well, we know there's going to be disruption, and we like disruption, and there was also talk of people, going into the administration. Obviously, there are representatives from the tech industry now, maybe a little less so in the DoD specifically right now, but I'm just wondering, now that we've had a couple months or a few weeks of this administration, what is there, how are they changing when it comes to some of these questions? Do you think there is an opportunity to sort of, do things completely differently and solve some of these long-standing problems, or is there not yet a clear indication that that's where they're going to be putting their focus?
Yeah. I would just say, for me, I think there is clearly an opportunity. Because you have people who come from a world where you have to move fast and get things done, and so there is an opportunity. Whether we take advantage of the opportunity or whether we just make everything chaotic is unknown to me at this point. The other factor that's different is that we also have adversaries that are working every day against us. And so it is different from commercial business in that there are millions of people around the world depending on Department of Defense to do its job every day. And then you have these adversaries we know about that are working against us. And so too much chaos can be counterproductive.
Right. Representative Reagan, I want to ask you specifically on that. There has been a couple reports that the U.S. has stood down its offensive cyber operations against Russia. And I don't know if you know anything about that or if you can share anything about it. Is that true?
So there's a good lesson in life that I've learned in this job, but I think I learned it before. First of all, I'm a 5-time commander, and I don't like chaos. I like stability, and I like people feeling that they don't have to watch their back at all times. I don't really like the atmosphere of the instability myself. I think you still push and make change without the chaos, so I'll just say that up front. I read this, there's 3 articles about how the United States stopped doing cyber ops against Russia, and the temptation is to say, okay, this is dumb, stupid, because I know the Russians are doing it to us, but I had the foresight to call the 4-star. It's a false story, and so it's not true. So I just hope, I appreciate you asking, because that story's going around. And I was assured by General Hawk, without going into a lot of detail, because obviously this is a sensitive area, that there's been no change in policy in regards to Russia on cyber. So I think that's an important
Right.
thing. When it comes to DoD, it's a little early how this is going to pan out, like Chairman Thornberry said. I'm all for putting a spotlight on how we spend, and I'm all for transparency, and then we should make smart decisions. Okay, that was dumb. How can we fix that? What I don't really care for is the quick trigger on just firing people or just stopping programs without, hey, what's the second and third order of effects here? So when you fire nuclear scientists, you may want to say, is that good or bad? Like FAA, is that good or bad? Okay, we're gonna have things in the DoD that we should be thoughtful about before we pull the trigger. I always liked it. We should be ready, aim, fire, right? And not ready, fire, aim. And I feel like some of the stuff we've seen in the last couple of weeks have been in that category. And the thought is, and I've talked to the White House, they said, well, okay, if we see where we broke something, we fix it. We put it back in. I don't know if that works in all cases. And I don't know that it works in the Pentagon where, like you say, we have threats looking at us. So I'm all about the transparency, but let's be a little more thoughtful. I put the phrase out, measure twice before you cut. And I think we got to do that with the DoD when we do this as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I covered Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, now X, very closely, and it's been a lot of deja vu the last few weeks. And I mean, that is their justification. They say, look, like the only way for us to find out what is crucial is by getting rid of everything. And then when we see where the real 5-alarm fires happen, then we quickly can fix that. And I agree. I think there's probably different opinions on whether that's happening or not. But unless we want to talk more about Mr. Musk, I wanted to talk about a word that you also mentioned earlier, Representative, which was deterrence. And I never feel like I'm pronouncing that right. I guess it's a word that I don't say out loud very often. But I mean, what can this administration do differently? I mean, do you think we, as the U.S., should be more aggressive, more open? I mean, maybe there's things going on that we don't know about, and so it's all fine. We can just be quiet about it. But I mean, in terms of the posture, how should we be changing?
So one thing the president does bring to deterrence, he's a little more unpredictable, and I think that does put people, they're not sure how he's going to respond. It does create some deterrence there. But when it comes to cyber, as I already mentioned, we got to change the rules of engagement for General Hawk and the Cyber Command. If China is eating our box lunch in the energy area and like we're talking about our cellular phone infrastructure, it's more than that. They're trying to get in our Wall Street. They're trying to get into agriculture. They're everywhere, and they're not just now doing it for collection. They're also doing it for malicious intent. And I don't think our rules of engagement are appropriate to counter that. We need to have the same. And I think we're trying to use, the rule of war. Is it within the rules of war to go after somebody's energy grid? We could debate that. Right now, our interpretation is not. I have a different interpretation. I studied the warden's targeting theory, right? And I think the energy grid's a very good target, but especially if they're going after your energy grid, because if you want to tell them not to go after your energy grid, then you got to threaten theirs. I believe that's how you get deterrence. Back to that dangerous word there. And I already mentioned this too. A CR does not deter. We need a 4% GDP spending. Right now we're at 2.9%, the lowest since 1940. Right? And 2.9% does not allow you to recap all three legs of your triad, 5th and 6th generation fighters. One attack submarine a year, that's terrible, right? We need to get to a spot where at 4, the president keeps saying 5, I'd be happy if we get to 4. But we can't deter where we're at and also take care of our forces, our servicemen and women the way they need it.
Sorry, Chairman, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just think this is such an important point. We spent so much time, effort, money, and brain power in the Cold War focusing on deterrence in a nuclear sense versus the Soviet Union. And there have been some articles saying, well, there's some lessons learned there that we can apply to cyber deterrence. But we haven't put nearly the effort into understanding how deterrence works in a cyber context that I think the importance of the domain demands. And just to emphasize what Don said, I remember in the Obama administration, they wanted to use cyber against some terrorist networks. They had to have an interagency meeting. It took forever, and it just wasn't effective. The first Trump administration delegated more authority to the commanders, and the effectiveness went up right away. And I think that's the sort of rules of engagement that Chairman Bacon is talking about that would make a huge difference. But he's also right that a dysfunctional government who can't even fund itself is not going to help deterrence. In a domain where there is conflict every single day. Remember, that's the thing about cyber that makes it different. It's happening now, so whether we can get a budget passed will affect how deterred they are going against our military targets that Josh is talking about, our civilian targets, and the whole society.
Yeah, I mean, Josh, I'm curious because I feel like from the when I'm thinking about the private cybersecurity industry, I mean, it's a lot about defense. It's about protecting networks. It's about making sure that things aren't hacked. And when we look at maybe like Israel's cybersecurity industry, I mean, they have gone on the offense in many ways, and they have private companies that will sell tools that are offensive to the highest bidder, and you can sort of have conversations about whether that's the right approach or not. But I'm wondering, like, what is kind of the appetite and the expertise for offensive cyber capabilities amongst the private industry here in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, so one of the remarkable things about being a cybersecurity professional is that there's not really a differentiation between offense and defense. You have to understand one to be good at the other. And specifically in this domain of deterrence and thinking about cybercom specifically, I mean, one of the I don't want to say frustrations, but maybe where I felt like we were maybe missing the forest for the trees a little bit was, obviously cybercom grew up at a national security agency, and NSA is, I cut my teeth there, one of the best organizations on the planet at cybersecurity, offensive and defensive. But it's very rooted in foreign intelligence, right? I mean, you hear about some of these, not tying these things together, but like you hear about Stuxnet, and you're like, oh my gosh, that's such a surprising result that we could have an effect on, a centrifuge, as an example. We know there are tremendous vulnerabilities in our weapon systems, right? For reasons, including adversaries stealing IP about our weapon systems and then adopting those into their own technologies. As well as just sort of plainly what we know about adversary platforms, it always occurred to me as a massively missed opportunity that we aren't spending considerable energy developing capabilities against enemy weapon systems. And you talk about deterrence, it also, frankly, like it's you don't have this sort of collateral damage question on a lot of these sorts of campaigns, and so. I think one of the best deterrents is, if we get into an elevated state of, conflict, that a logistics supply chain doesn't work, a sortie doesn't take off because we've triggered, something that we put in place 18 months prior. I think that for, relatively little marginal investment in that space and kind of expanding our scope beyond just thinking about foreign intelligence from a military context, we could have a tremendous impact on our adversaries' willingness to fight.
Right. We have about 6 minutes left. I don't know if there's any questions from the audience. Anyone wants to jump in?
Well, people think about question, if I just would say, we've already had a couple successes, me being the chair on the committee. We set up a 3-star sub-unified command that will organize all of our defensive cyber. And we want to ensure we have unified effort and coordination, so we got that. And also we're going to help fund hackathon. We got to recruit people like Mac Thornberry, that's a genius on cyber stuff, right? But with different color hair. No, I'm just teasing. But we want to be able to recruit more, so we got that done too in the last couple months.
Yeah, the Reagan Institute should do a hackathon of its own. I don't know. I don't know how many coders there are in this room right now, but
Never too late.
Yeah, exactly. We have ChatGPT now, right?
Right.
So yeah.
To your point on deterrence, so is deterrence dysfunctional in cyber? Like, is deterrence dead? Do we need to redefine deterrence? Because we're talking the difference between nuclear and, right, like cyber. which is a total different situation. So do we have to redefine that language?
If you have people attacking our energy grid and we're not willing to do it ourselves, you're not deterring. We got to carry a bigger stick.
I would just say, I think there may be lessons from nuclear deterrence that could be applied in a cyber context, but it's a lot more complicated, as Don was just saying. And we need to put the effort into thinking about how to deter in cyber, where you may not know exactly who's doing what, where there may be consequences you don't see right away. I mean, there's all sorts of complications in it, but the point is, cyber is integrated into everything we do in the military and in society. And it's a whole lot better if you can prevent the bad guys from messing things up than to come clean up after they've already done it. That's deterrence. And I think Don is exactly on the right track with his subcommittee to focus on what does deterrence mean in cyber, how can we best deter, but it's going to take a lot of effort by a lot of folks.
There's also a seam on the public and the defense side that we got to work through. But, sir, go ahead.
Thank you, Teresa Moore, Inside Defense. I was just wondering, we're talking a lot about cyber common deterrence, but at the same time, do we have the infrastructure to back that up or to build our own capability to the degree that we need it? You know, it takes a lot of energy, a lot of compute power, a lot of cooling power. So where's our infrastructure for that, and how do we build it up if we need more?
Maybe is that more in your wheelhouse?
Yeah. I mean, I think ironically, the infrastructure that maybe needs the most attention within the, DoD's cyber capabilities is the people. I think that talent has been, ever since I was, in uniform, working at NSA, working at Cyber Command, Cyber National Mission Forces. Talent management has been a big topic, and I know there's, some of the report card kind of touches on this. But we got to figure out a way, and there's so many different kinds of directions here, but we got to figure out a way of taking the windows of time that super talented young men and women want to spend on this mission and applying that with the highest leverage against mission, even if they don't want to do a 20-year career or they want to serve in a different kind of capacity. I think you get the people part of this right, and everything else will kind of click into place.
I think in our industrial, we have some problems with our supply chains on hardware. I think in the area that you're talking about, I think we're in a better spot. It's the people. Yep. You're absolutely right.
Are we getting Oscared out
Yes.
here? Yeah. Says 2 minutes, but sorry, one more over there.
Sure.
Go for it.
Right. Thanks for all the comments. 2 quick questions. One, do you think it makes sense to articulate red lines in cyberspace? I know there's an active debate about that. And 2, you mentioned we can strengthen deterrence by improving coordination with the private sector, but also with allies. And so I want to focus on the second part. Are there low-hanging fruit opportunities to improve intelligence sharing or offensive capabilities for some of our cyber allies, especially in highly contested regions like the Indo-Pacific? Thanks.
I'll address part of that. Cyber Command does a great job working with other countries. They partner where they can, but they also, where countries will allow them into their networks and help find the bad guys. And then out of that, they build a relationship that is a win-win relationship working together. So I think Cyber Command's being pretty good on this. And red lines, I think I'm more about speaking softly and scaring them. But maybe I'd tell them privately, you mess with us, we're going to. But I think it's better to have the capability and show that you're willing to use it in the cyber side too. So maybe it's a combination of both. Right now, like I said earlier, they're eating our box lunch and we're doing nothing. So.
Yeah, and I would just say, if there's any place that is the most obvious for where working with allies is essential, it ought to be cyber, where geography doesn't really matter. So absolutely that. The one thing I would add to what Don mentioned is export controls sometimes are a problem. When we try to work with others, even some of our closest allies on things, there's all sorts of challenges in doing that. Updating our export control laws would be helpful.
I would just add, one open question, something that's like very interesting about this domain in terms of deterrence is these cyber campaigns don't happen in a microsecond. Especially against a hard target, if it's an adversary classified network or it's a weapon system or it's a centrifuge or an electric grid or what have you. You got different parts of your campaign where one part is constantly trying to gain access. You're stealing credentials, you're finding vulnerabilities in servers, you're pivoting between systems to try to hopscotch to the right spot in the network. And then you've got, kind of holding that asset at risk, right? So once you get into that network, periodically checking and making sure you still have control over it, you can have the effect at the time and place you're choosing. This is a very unique model among any other kinds of effects you might want to have from a military context, And so where do you put these red lines? It's a very interesting question. Is it, hey, we are not okay with you, sort of seeking access and trying to compromise the system even if you don't have an effect on it, and then, the question of, well, how do we comply with those norms, or do we ourselves, say one thing and do another? These are very complicated questions. I don't know the answer to
I
necessarily.
like Sun Tzu. A little deception's good.
A little-
Hey, if I may, if I could throw out, there's two issues that we're going to be debating on in the next year or two. One is, are we going to have a cyber service? I think the general position for most of us is no, but there are some in our committee that want it. So there's going to be a debate like we had with space. I don't think I'm not convinced that's needed. The second thing is, do you want 2 4-stars? It's still, the intelligence people want a 4-star for NSA and a 4-star for cyber. Us on the operational side want unified command because they work together. They are one team. If you have 2 4-stars, you pull them apart, you got dysfunction. But I'll just tell you, these are 2 issues that are not resolved right now that we're going to be debating.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for the panel, and yeah, we'll move on.